a couple minutes here.
Yeah, cool.
Right. All right. I mean, just because we have a couple minutes or a minute or so, if anyone wants to write in the chat, just like anything that they're looking forward to for today's conference, could be this session specifically, it could be something that you took away from yesterday, just like doing a check-in. How are you guys feeling about things so far? What are you looking forward to? I know this, Mark, I'll warn you, this group likes to write in the chat versus and
All
I'll
right.
read off the questions versus
Yeah.
but again, as yesterday, if anyone would like to use the raise hand function at any point during this, I think the Q&A will probably be at the end, but feel free, or you can write in the chat at any point and we'll get to them when it's time.
And Sam, I don't see everyone because I'm screen sharing, so don't hesitate to pop in and interrupt or what have you. Oh,
No.
my vacuum I have a robot vacuum and it just stopped. I'm gonna turn it off.
Okay.
I'm obviously working from home.
Heather, learning even more about the Holocaust than you before. That's wonderful. Thank you. We have. I'm so excited about the sessions that we have today. I can't find the raise hand feature. You know, Zoom changed things around, which isn't great. I think it's in the React section. Like, it's a heart at the bottom of the screen. There's like a little carrot, where you can do the um raise hand. I think. If anyone wants to test that, feel free. I won't call on you.
I found the chat.
Great, Mark. There it is. Okay, good. We found it. Yeah, Zoom definitely changed a little bit. So,
I can't make it
all
go
right.
away. There we go.
Has the robot vacuum been neutralized?
Yeah, neutralized. Yeah.
All right. We're gonna go ahead and get started, but we'll just keep letting people in. Feel free to keep writing in the chat. I love seeing these comments. I do read all of them. But I will get started this morning. Thank you guys so much for coming again for day 2 of Navigating the Holocaust. I'm again Sam Goldberg, and I'm back by popular demand. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Mark Gudgel, who's an 18-year veteran of teaching English, humanities, and genocide studies in the public schools. Presently, he serves as the assistant professor of education at the College of St. Mary in Omaha. Gudgel is a fellow of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Imperial War Museum, and Fund for Teachers, as well as a Fulbright Distinguished Awards in Teaching recipient. In each instance, his work focused on various aspects of Holocaust and genocide education. Gudgel spent 6 years working for the U.S. Holocaust Museum as the member of the Regional Education Corps. He co-founded the Educators Institute for Human Rights with his colleague, Drew Beider, and served as the organization's executive director for 6 years. Presently, Gudgel's research centers around documenting and preserving Sarajevo roses, primary resources from the siege of Sarajevo, and how teachers around the United States teach about genocide. Today, his presentation is from Like Wolves to War, and I am so excited to hear from you, Mark. So The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Sam. Thank you so much for having me, and Jennifer, thank you as well. This was a great experience last year and a great opportunity to speak with you all. Am I pretty audible? I see. Okay, I see some heads nodding. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Um, so I wanted to begin this morning with really probably the most important thing I have to say, and that's simply thank you. Um, I recently had, as Sam said, I'm a college professor. I recently had a colleague, a former colleague who I taught with at Omaha North High, email me, and the email came at like 1 o'clock in the morning, right? And so there's some inferences I might draw, but it said some very nice things. Mike said, you were always, he was a special education teacher, and he said, you were always the best at working with my students, and said some really kind and touching things. And he concluded with the sentiment that you need to get your happy ass out of the ivory tower and get back into the classroom because that's where you're needed. And I'll admit that my wife was actually offended when I shared that with her. And my thought, I said, he's got a point. And so I want to acknowledge teachers that you're giving up your time today to learn things, that your time is incredibly precious, and that nobody works harder than classroom teachers. And so I'm really grateful to you for being here. More importantly, I think I'm grateful to you for the work you do. So I wanted to start by saying thank you. Today's session is something that I'd given a lot of thought to, but I hadn't ever presented on. And then Sam asked me to. And then when word got out that I was going to present on this, a couple other people had me present on it as well. So I've worked through this a little bit, although I've been tinkering with my slides, and I think you're going to get the best version. The misunderstanding that the Jews of Europe went, quote unquote, like sheep to the slaughter, it has been widely perpetrated by a number of people, not least scholars. And it's always, sort of upset me, and I think other people as well. It's an offensive idea, but just as importantly, it's erroneous. It's not accurate. I think that the phrase sheep to the slaughter probably originates just because people are so drawn to assonance. And so I made sure to employ that literary device with my, title today. But what we're going to talk about today is resistance. Resistance to the Holocaust by its victims specifically. And so if I can get the slide to change, there we go. I want to begin with what I think is a really important understanding, and it isn't necessarily something that we're taught or wrestle with much. But there's a fair bit of study, maybe too much, I don't know, on heroism. And I say maybe too much because not, during the Holocaust, I say maybe too much because if everybody was a hero, we wouldn't have the Holocaust to talk about. In fact, if even just a reasonable number of people were heroic, there would be no Holocaust to talk about. The heroes are worth talking about because they were so rare. But there's a distinction to be made, not that one is better than the other, between the hero who is not at risk themselves and sticks their neck out to protect others, and the person who resists what's being perpetrated against them. And I think that so often when we look at it as an umbrella at resistance to the Nazis, what we're looking at is exterior. We're looking at Oskar Schindler is by far the most famous example, but thanks to Steven Spielberg and Thomas Keneally, but there are many others. But we're typically looking at outsiders fighting back, or insiders in the case of like Klaus von Stauffenberg, who attempted to assassinate Hitler. And I think it's really important when we think of the Holocaust as a Jewish story and a Jewish event to look at the Jewish resistance specifically. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So that's how we've narrowed the lens to something that we might be able to manage in an hour. Um, I'll add to that that I hope that I don't take anywhere near an hour. I don't intend to, and that we'll just have time to open it up and chat. You know, it can be Q&A or just observations shared. People tend to have a lot to say about this, I've found. So, um, you know, resistance, I just like that graphic. By the way, this slide is almost completely unnecessary. I could have just said that. I just was Googling around sometime back in like February and found that. And I was like, yeah, we should throw the swastika away. Um, anyway, resistance takes a lot of different forms, and I didn't list them all here. But, and often I've found people come up with other descriptions of different kinds of resistance they want to share and want to talk about and have examples of. And I think that's really cool. So this is just a starting point, but we're going to look at these today and look at examples. And then I'm happy to steer you towards resources as well. I'll mention some, certainly not all of them. And then maybe others will put things in the chat and things like that as well, if you've got good examples, which I suspect you do. So one kind of resistance and the type that gets the most attention is armed resistance. Now, this was relatively rare, largely because you know, it wasn't real common for civilians to be packing heat in Europe. And so, you know, arming yourself wasn't easy. Um, it's also uncommon because there weren't a tremendous number of opportunities to do this. But the examples that we have are things that students, I think, gravitate towards and find very interesting. And there's certainly things that you can tap into. So ZOB is a Polish acronym, and my Polish is terrible, so I'll spare you. But that was the group led by Mordecai Anielewicz that led the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted close to 5 weeks. And if you consider politely that the Netherlands fell in 5 days, that France capitulated in 2 weeks, I think that in that perspective, the idea that a group of sickened, weakened, emaciated freedom fighters who armed themselves with what few actual weapons they could smuggle in and what are called Molotov cocktails and you know, explosives, homemade grenades basically, and that this group managed to last for longer than whole nations is incredible when they went to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto. I think it's important, if we're teaching this to students, also to acknowledge that I don't think Anielewicz and other members of the ZOB were under the impression that they were going to defeat the SS, that they were going to defeat the Nazis or Germany. I think they chose how they were going to die. And I think that's heroic and noteworthy. The Bielski Otriad, you are probably familiar with. These are partisan fighters. There's an entire organization devoted just to partisans, Jewish partisans specifically. It's called JPEF, Jewish Partisan Education Foundation. I think they're based in San Francisco. Bless you there, Sam. And they were, you know, the Belskis, there were the two brothers, but they formed a group and they fought back militarily. The movie starring Daniel Craig called Defiance is about this. And, you know, it's, I realize we have a limited amount of time in which to show movies, but it's one that you might look into, right? And there are certainly other examples, many other examples of partisans other than the Bielski triad as well. And then there was the prisoner revolt at Auschwitz, in which Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners who were forced to work in the gas chamber crematoria installations, smuggled in enough weaponry, enough explosives to dynamite an entire crematoria. And I mean, that is a really, if you, it's such a remarkable thing to think about, like how much bravery and effort and time and risk and everything that went into that. Um, and so that's another example that I think students find very interesting. Um, I also want to point out I used there are some very, very famous photos from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I used maybe a slightly lesser known one, but I wanted to point to the note that I put at the bottom, and I'm just modeling there. It's not really what the talk is about, but my dissertation and a lot of my study is on film. And it's really important, especially with raw footage and photographs, to analyze, where did this come from? Why was it created? What is behind the photographer? Um, what are they attempting to portray? Has it been doctored? What's on the edges? What can't I see in this footage and so forth? And so when you know that your footage was created by people, for example, Jürgen Stroop, um, who had a reason, a very distinctive reason for creating it. I think that sharing that with your students and analyzing it is a really good practice. We can talk more about that some other time if you like. Um, so I want to talk now about spiritual resistance. And this is a different type, of course, and you could say, why are we categorizing this? And it's really for our minds to compartmentalize it. I don't know that you need to like assign students to, look at different types of resistance. And I don't know that you need to call this spiritual. You could call it something else if you wanted to, right? This could be, in these instances, religious resistance, I suppose. One of my favorite examples here is the marriage of Joseph and Rebecca Bow. Um, and famous because this is portrayed in Schindler's List, but they literally got married in secret in Plaszow concentration camp, right under the nose of Amon Garth. Um, and the idea that a Jewish wedding, insofar as this was possible, right? I think we can infer that there were probably some missing elements. But that an observant Jewish wedding took place in a concentration camp is in my thinking, such a beautiful thing. There were certainly those, and you encounter this a lot in survivor testimony. There was a lot of prayer, Jewish observance as much as there could be. One of the things I wrote, observant. Uh, I would never want to weigh in on this with a judgment, but in Elie Wiesel's Night and in many other survivor testimonies, there's talk of fasting. And, boy, when you're starving to death, the idea of fasting is really hard for me to wrap my head around. And I would never want to suggest that I would never want to suggest it was foolish, um, because it's religion played out, right? Trial of God, I mentioned Elie Wiesel. He wrote a play to this effect, but there's also a BBC film that was produced on it. And there actually were a group of Jewish thinkers in Auschwitz who put on a trial. People, if you're looking for something to get bent out of shape about, I suppose you could, some people might choose that. But the reality is that they were wrestling with the idea that if we're the chosen people, how on earth has this fate befallen us? It was a very compelling mental exercise. And you can read and learn more about that, of course. Um, and students find that compelling as well. This is one of my very favorite examples Um, and I've titled it intellectual resistance, although again, I think you start to see that some of these categories can blend. But there was, I'm going to jump right to this part. There was a library kept in the Łódź ghetto. And I am going to, if you don't mind, read you an excerpt. So I'm actually pulling the excerpt out of a different book, my book. But it comes from this text, which some of you may have seen. This is Ruth Minsky Sender's The Cage. It's a really compelling piece of writing. It's a true story. It's her survivor testimony. And it's written at about an eighth grade level. It's really manageable. I've taught it to high schools, and they don't mind the fact that it isn't difficult to read, but it really covers a lot of ground. She was in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück and Łódź, um, and tells the story well. And then she wrote a follow-up too, and these are less common, but she wrote about life after the war, a couple books actually, but the one that you might seek out is called L'Chaim, to life. And so here's her writing about the library of Jewish literature that was assembled in the Łódź ghetto. For 5 years, we have fought for survival and dignity, living like human beings in spite of the savagery around us. I look at the closed curtains that hide the books, the source of our strength. They nourish our minds even while our bodies were withering. They helped us believe in a better tomorrow. What do we do with them? What will happen to the books now? As if reading my thoughts, Moishel says, Riva, the books will survive. Knowledge cannot be killed. Look at these books. We have kept them from perishing in the flames for 5 years. They have kept us from perishing morally. They will survive. You are right, my dear brother. Ideas cannot be killed. The books carry the beautiful ideas of freedom, justice, brotherhood. The Nazis may destroy the books, but the wonderful ideas for a better world will survive. We'll let the books stay right here on hidden shelves in an empty ghetto to remind the Nazis of the spirit they could not destroy. I don't think that the people of Łódź were in a position to resist in an armed manner. But I also think that even if they could, it wouldn't have been any more effective than the ideas that Riva or Ruth Sender shares there. And then this is a slide I just added this morning. And I have been, thinking about this for a long time. This idea that survival was resistance. The Jews were a people who were supposed to be murdered in totality, according to Nazi ideology. And the mechanisms of death existed to make that happen. There was a will and there was a way. There were unlimited concentration camps. There were 6 death camps that had the capacity to kill millions and did, right? There were mobile killing squads. There was isolation and disease. There was a war going on. And yet, the Jewish people have not only survived, but prosper. And this is an example, and I suspect many of you have met survivors. Some of you may still know survivors. Many of you may teach using survivor testimony, which I think is a great idea, whether that's in film or book form. This is just one person, and if you look at the little girl, I met her long after this photograph was taken. I met her 10 years ago in London. And no, that's not true. In Royal Bassett, Swindon, sorry. But her name is Ava Clark. And she was born in the Mauthausen concentration camp while it was still an operational concentration camp. That's, I have no desire to create a hierarchy, but I'm sure you're aware there were a number of people born in DP camps, and thousands of people born in the concentration camps as they became DP camps, in some cases as many as 10 years that they remained open. But in this instance, Ava's mother not only became pregnant, but carried a child to term and delivered a healthy child in Mauthausen while it was still a concentration camp under the control of the SS. And, that's remarkable in countless ways. But at least, right, that what better way to resist the attempted annihilation of an entire group of people than to create more of them? And I find that truly beautiful and touching. And Eva's just an incredible person. You can read more about her. I'd be happy to send you links and things like that. She still speaks. Uh, she's very spry, actually. Wonderful person. So, um, so to kind of conclude my thoughts, at least before we maybe launch into some conversation, I think there's a lot as teachers, pedagogically, that we have to consider when we think about teaching about resistance. I'm often asked to speak about teaching about heroism, and specifically Schindler's List, because I've written a lot about Schindler's List. And, I always caution teachers, number one, I will never tell a teacher what to do. It's your classroom, they're your students, you know what you're doing. So I'm, as one of my favorite yoga instructors says, I make suggestions, you make decisions. But if I were to make suggestions, when we think about heroism, I'm like, don't overemphasize this. I get that it can be kind of a feel-good story, that it can seem sort of empowering, but the reality is that you're studying anomalies. And while, yes, I think heroism science is an emerging field and a cool field, and I think it's really neat to think about how we can instill bravery and courage and the ability and willingness to act upon your moral compass in people, you know. Uh, when we look at any act of genocide, I think we have to go, okay, like if there were a whole lot of heroes floating around, that would not have happened. It's not just the Holocaust, right? You look at Rwanda, where I worked for many years, and there are some extraordinary stories of heroism. There are a handful of really amazing outsiders like Philippe Gaillard and Carl Wilkins. There were far more. Oh, and Romeo Dallaire, I can never not mention him. Um, there were far more Rwandans on the ground. Damascus Simba, the entire Muslim population almost. The minister who protected Immaculée Ilibagiza and others. But the vast majority of the civilians in Rwanda were killers, directly or indirectly. Either they were complicit in that they made no attempt to stop it, or they were actually participatory. Hundreds of thousands. And so, to just teach about heroism, I think is a mistake. And similarly, I think if we zero in on an act of resistance and go, well, look, the Bielski Otriad, this is a quote unquote, if you can't see my fingers air quoting this, cool story. Okay. But boy, if that becomes someone's story of the Holocaust, I think I would venture to say that they don't understand the Holocaust very well. And so if we're trying to teach our students something a little more holistically, um, then I want to try to plant all of these seeds and hope that, by sharing a passage like the one I did, someone will go read the cage. And, by mentioning Mordecai Onyelevitz and the ZOB, I mean, Onyelevitz was like 19 years old. Your high schoolers, your young college students will see themselves in him, you know. By asking students to think about why you would preserve literature. A generation of people who seemingly does not value reading the way that, I mean, I'm a college professor and I was an English teacher, so, that's probably not a fair value statement to make about an entire generation. But my son loves to read and it delights me. He reads Dogman, which does not delight me, and Captain Underpants, which annoys me, but he's reading and I don't ever interfere with that. I love that he reads. So why would a group of people spend very important energy and time to protect literature in a setting like the Łódź Ghetto? Some really big questions that we can get around to. And so the questions I put on the board are just things to board, right, screen, sorry, are just things to sort of kick around mentally, and think about how we might approach this. So that's my overview of resistance. And I would like to hear less of my voice and more of yours. I think what I'll do, I'm going to pop over here. I can put that in the chat as well. That's my email address. And don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to send you resources or just share ideas. Happy to give you my phone number as well if you prefer to talk or text. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can get a better image of the people I'm speaking with. And I'd love to hear, if you have questions, by all means, ask them. If you have thoughts, please feel free to share them. I'm not the only person in the room that knows what I'm talking about. So maybe you've got some great stuff to share with your fellow educators. That would be a great use of time here, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Derry, were you coming off mute?
Yeah, I was. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Lisa, hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Good to see you.
Good. I have a quick question about Ava Clark, the little girl that was born.
Yeah.
Who was her father? Was it a Nazi SS guard, or was an actual Jewish man in the camp as well?
That's an excellent question. And I heard Eva speak about that, and I'm trying to remember. I'm actually going to pull up an article I was just referencing as I was putting that slide together because I was looking for a better picture than the one of me with her. I'm not certain that is, I don't want to say known because of course it's known. I'm not certain that it's something that she has widely shared. So I'm going to try to sort that while we continue here, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. I'm not still screen sharing, am I?
No, you're not.
Okay, thanks. Just making sure.
We have a note from Karen that said she recently returned from the Baltics, where she toured Holocaust museums in Lithuania and Latvia, especially.
Wow.
And the museums there featured resistance as mentioned in this lesson. Ooh, do you know the names of those Holocaust museums by chance?
Are you asking me or are you asking the person who made the
I
comment?
was asking Karen, but I mean, if you have them too.
I'll join in here. I was in Vilnius, and the common name for the one in Vilnius is the greenhouse, but don't confuse that with the restaurant. And I can look up, I'll have to find my notes and look it up for you, but it's gay, Gaon. There's a grouping of Holocaust museums in Lithuania. And I have to thank Herc because a number of years ago, I attended a session about Holocaust by bullets and learned about the Einsatzgruppen and how the Einsatzgruppen in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, but especially Lithuania and Latvia, 95% of the Jews in Lithuania were killed, Holocaust by bullets. Just appalling the high numbers, because so often in our classrooms we focus on Auschwitz, but when you look at the Einsatzgruppen, just horrendous. So that was the one in Vilnius. There's, you have the mass execution sites that are outside of Vilnius as well. In Riga, it's whatever the Holocaust Museum is there in Riga, but they also have a lot of information. So both of these sites have particular units that deal, or parts of their museum that deal with resistance movements. And as you said, just the idea of survival, those who just would do little things like smuggling to kind of deception and whatever they could get away with to survive. So it was very eye-opening being in the Baltics, because we hear, as I said, we hear so much about what went on in Poland and those other areas versus what happened in the Baltics. And I'll let you talk now, Mark, your comment on that.
Well, I think, Karen, I appreciate that a lot. I've spent very little time in the Baltics, quite a bit in the Balkans. And what that speaks to me is how localized history is. I actually, or can be, right? And I wrote quite a bit about what I kind of clumsily refer to as Auschwitz, and, right? Auschwitz was the death camp that had a sort of a hybrid status, the death camp that had a labor camp attached to it. And so we wind up with, way more people, 1.2 million dead at Auschwitz, but then many, many more survivors of Auschwitz than, say, Majdanek, Treblinka, Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor, right? And so it becomes Auschwitz because of Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, Ruth Sender, so many others. It becomes for many the story of the Holocaust. Or you've got the story of Anne Frank, who is a German girl in hiding in Amsterdam, right? And that becomes for many the story of the Holocaust. And so I love looking at, for example, the Baltics, as you were, and looking at not only maybe lesser taught, lesser known histories, but also the idea that the Holocaust manifests itself in different ways at different times and in different places, and helping students to layer that history, I think is brilliant. Elie Wiesel wrote the introduction to a book one time, Darkness and Hope by Sam Halpern, in which he notes that Sam Halpern was liberated before he was ghettoized in Zyget and then deported to Auschwitz. And so there was someone who had, and Wiesel writes, of course, very eloquently about this, but this Halpern had lived through the Holocaust and survived it before Elie Wiesel's memoir Night begins. And, so you start to look at that those layers of history, and how things are different in different places. And I think it's really remarkable.
And then Mark, we have a question from Jennifer in the chat asking, do you know how resistance is taught in Germany today?
Oh, that's interesting. Resistance specifically, not as in no, it's not taught, but in no, I haven't looked specifically into how that's taught the way I have like in the United States. I think it probably won't surprise you, but it's worth mentioning. The Germans and the Austrians are about as good at teaching about the Holocaust as anyone, probably better. But, I think here in the United States, we do some really amazing work, and I think the English do it very well also. And there are others, but I don't know specifically. I can speak to like what I've seen in museums in Germany, in Berlin and Munich. It's certainly not a topic that they skirt around. But that's about as far as I can go.
Oh, Lisa just did a plug for your book. I love
Oh,
this one. We gave it out last year, I think,
thanks,
for
Lisa.
navigating. Think higher, feel deeper. It's absolutely amazing. So plugging for that too. I'm wondering if you could touch, I think you mentioned it briefly in the beginning, like talking about like how teachers can balance talking about Jewish resistance and non-Jewish resistance. Because I know like the White Rose and especially with the Wisconsin connection, like the Circle with Mildred Fish Harnack, like those are also kind of also follows like higher resistance. So I'm wondering how you might ask teachers to like balance the two.
So if I understand you correctly, Sam, thinking about how we balance teaching about Jewish resistance and non-Jewish resistance,
Yeah,
or
because I think, I mean, obviously there's like that obvious trying to fight that stereotype of like sheep to the slaughter. I think it's
yeah.
super important to kind of elevate the Jewish resistance, but also knowing time restraints. Do you think it's still important to bring up non-Jewish resistance? Because again, you mentioned they stick their neck out when there's no one coming out for them. I'm just wondering how you might recommend kind of dancing that line.
Sure. I think, and I realize every state is different when you've got a mandate, when you've got particular goals you have to meet and certain things built into the curriculum. I was so fortunate. I taught a class on the Holocaust in high schools, two different courses on the Holocaust in two different high schools that were electives, and I could do more or less whatever I thought needed to be done. But I realize that's not everybody's reality. And so you've got time constraints, and then you've got the curriculum and what you're expected to be doing and so on and so forth. And so I think part of what what any teacher needs to be doing is going, okay, how do I make sure I get to continue to do this? And then how do I plant seeds that my students will find interesting and pursue? So like, Bill Younglove once said to me, I would never show Schindler's List. It would take 5% of the year, like his time in the classroom. And I went, that is a really compelling argument. However, if you wanted to talk about spiritual resistance to the Holocaust, you could show 90 seconds worth of film from Schindler's List in which the wedding takes place in Plaszow, and let students know, hey, this is a pretty compelling movie, and I'm going to order some pizzas and show it at 5 o'clock after swim practice tonight in my classroom, or you can find it on Netflix or whatever, So I think a lot of what I try to do, and I've been really gratified that my students are receptive to this, is to plant seeds, as I call it, to say, here is more learning you can do. So in a short amount of time, we point out things that we think are really important and in some instances meet our curricular goals or state mandates or what have you. and then send people, our students, toward other materials. To be a little more direct, Sam, I think there is room for both. I do think it's important to dispel the notion that the Jews were just some hapless group of people. And part of that, don't start in ghettos. I don't even start in 1933. I mean, before we can appreciate what was lost, we have to know what was lost. And so I think that no matter how little time you have, assuming you're not teaching in a Jewish school, which some of you may be, if you've got a room full of Gentiles, as I often did, and I am one, then making sure that we touch on Judaism. I teaching in Nebraska for years had students that were predominantly Christians. And so I had a little 10-minute talk that I'd give with illustrations I'd draw up on the board where I'd lay out the Tanakh, right? The Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, and explain, right? The Torah is the law, and the Nevi'im are the prophets, and the Ketuvim are the writings. And this contains books you've heard of, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so on and so forth, right? And then add to that what Christians refer to as the New Testament and go, so 80% of your Christian Bible is the Jewish Bible, or as the Jews call it, the Bible, and try to help them see how much commonality there was there, right? Not to suggest that they're the same thing. They're not, right? But I think that, combined with the simple historical reality that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, if you want to debate whether he's God or not, knock yourself out, but there's no debating historically that he was a Jew. So those things, I think, helped, my students kind of come into this like, okay, so the only thing I really knew about Jews were the stereotypes I picked up watching South Park. Now I see them maybe as people, right? And I was always really careful if I had a Jewish student not to make them the representative of Judaism. That's completely unfair. Don't do that, But there's an awful lot of material out there, like Jewish Virtual Library and things, where you can put together a pretty nice little introduction to Judaism that I think helps students see this group of people who maybe practice a religion that they don't and lived long ago and far away as human. And that's a really important starting point.
I have a comment from Scott in the chat. There's that talking about the spring at Viterbo. There's a Holocaust conference where I think Stephen Feinberg was the one who did this chat. This conversation was really fantastic. Saying that the reality of the Holocaust was about murder, starvation, torture, and so much more, and to shield your students and only about Holocaust heroes is not really teaching the reality of the Holocaust. And the heroes are just complex, or part of the complex story of the Holocaust. I totally agree there.
Absolutely. Did you say did Stephen Feinberg speak here yesterday?
No, not here. He spoke in Viterbo over the spring. I don't know how they managed to get him. I was hanging on every word.
He's a national treasure.
Yes.
He is just wonderful. If you ever have the chance, I'm speaking to everybody, and I would include myself, go. He's a wonderful man.
And I actually had another question. So what about the role of like deception, like Nazi deception in the conversation about resistance and the ability to resist? Could you speak on that?
Yeah. And that's really important. And there's some nuance to it that, we never want to paint with a broad brush. I love the understanding that the Holocaust was not the murder of 6 million. It was 6 million murders. I think that distinction is so powerful, right? we have to think of things in individualized terms, and that's, I think, part of the reason that survivor testimony is so valuable. So the Nazis went, and we're really thinking, so the camps were an SS operation. The SS started small as a group of bodyguards in a division of the SA and became this overblown mechanism that had its own army, the Waffen. And but the camps were an SS operation, and the extent that they went to manipulate is really astonishing, and you'll read Night and you'll go, why in the hell is there a hospital in Auschwitz? But also why, because you may be familiar with the sign Arbeit macht frei, right? Loosely in German, work will set you free, which we know is an outright lie. But that wasn't just at Auschwitz. If you go to Dachau, you'll see that. And it's not in the same style. That gate at Auschwitz may be unique. I haven't seen another one, certainly. But it's built into a gate in a different way at Dachau. And it was written at other labor camps as well. And why are we telling people that work will set them free? Well, because we want them to work and they want to be free. It's pretty straightforward, actually. It's not true. The effort, was to kill everyone. The only reason there's a labor camp at Auschwitz is because they couldn't possibly kill everybody who arrived there at one time. Auschwitz was designed to murder 25,000 people a day, but it had 44 sets of train tracks running in and out of it. And so they didn't have the capacity to murder everybody all at once. And so they had to put them to work, and they wanted them to actually work, and they wanted them to not fight back. If you look at what we talked about earlier, the dynamiting of Crematoria 4, well, this was done by Sonderkommandos. And these are people who are working in the gas chamber crematoria. Well, there's no deceiving them. They know what's going on, which is why regularly Sonderkommandos were murdered themselves and then replaced with a new group. And so and there are others, right? I mean, if you want to talk about deception, looking at Theresienstadt, or probably, I'm in the habit of calling it Theresienstadt because that's how I taught of it for so long. That's the German renaming of it. It's really Theresien, but it was a walled city that turned into sort of a hybrid ghetto and camp. It had schools, it had theaters, it had children. Right. But this was all so that they could fool the International Red Cross. And so there were all and they succeeded. And so there were all kinds of deceptions built in. And I think, some of it, I don't know how hard we work to try to get our students to wrap their head around Nazi mentality. That doesn't seem like a great use of time to me. But I do think that if we're trying to understand how a group of people, didn't entirely rise up and fight back. I mean, if there's 6 million dead, well, if 6 million people rose up simultaneously, well, yeah, sure, but that's not going to happen. And understanding the deception is part of that. That also leads to, I think, a really important point. And if you've, I'm not trying to plug my book, but I can send you this passage from it if you want. But I spent a lot of time with Miriam Klein-Kasanoff writing her story, and because I think it does such a great job of illustrating how hard it was to get out. And the question, once you illustrate that, once you show students, how much effort was required to leave, right? So number one, I have to leave my home, and I can't sell it, right? So I'm abandoning my only assets, and maybe my family's lived in this home for 8 generations and in this city, right? And I can't get my money out of the bank if I have any, and my sister's going to stay here. So I'm leaving my family. My parents can't go, whatever. And then we've got to sneak across borders, and we have to get visas, and we have to have those translated, and it all costs boatloads of money, right? And this is hard, and this is harder, and this is almost impossible, right? And in the case of the Klein family, Maurice Klein and his family, they wind up in the United States. But they're rare, right? I mean, it's pretty well documented. The United States was not exactly trying to get more Jews to move in during this period of time, quite the opposite, in fact. And so you look at how hard it was to leave, and the question changes from why didn't they just leave to how did so many of them manage to leave? And I think that if you can get your students to pivot in that way, you've done something pretty special. So.
Just a practical question also for the classroom educators on the call. Where and when do you recommend that teachers talk about resistance in their Holocaust unit?
Yeah, I think, you know, and I actually could pull this data for Wisconsin if you wanted it, to tell you approximately how much time the average teacher has. But I know that across the United States, the average teacher has less than a week to teach about the Holocaust. Some people have a day, right? And so I think so much of it is contingent upon you know, what resources you have, what your objectives are, and how much time you have. And so, you know, if you've got a day, resistance isn't going to come up if I have a day. You know, I am going to work really hard to share things that I find personally very compelling. For example, spending a little bit of time talking about the difference between the murder of 6 million and 6 million murders, trying to individualize it, trying to connect students to that history and make it interesting. And I'm going to end with, here are a bunch of really cool movies that you could watch, right? Because they like to watch movies. And that's another thing I love to do is assign extra credit. I teach a course now to undergraduates called The Holocaust Through Literature and Film. And I just love being like, hey, we don't have time to get to this in class. If you find you have time, watch this movie, write up a response to it and send it to me, and I'll magically change the B you got on that last paper to an A. And, you know, they get something out of it, but they also, you know, what they really get out of it is that they took the time to watch that movie, and I try to select things that I think are valuable to them. So, you know, again, thinking about where resistance fits in, if, for example, you had a unit on ghettos or a day where you were teaching about ghettos, absolutely work the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising into that. And heck, now, you know, work the Gudgel library into that, and you could explore two different kinds of resistance, two different approaches, you know. But I really just think it's a matter of time. So.
We have a question from Lisa in the chat. In your book, you talk about the downfalls of sharing the movie Schindler's List. Could you address that?
Yeah. Part of this, I have over time, I'm turning into a curmudgeon. I'll tell you, I understand, you know, Schindler's List was until recently the most popular movie for teaching about the Holocaust. And I understand why. It's really well done. It's super compelling. It pulls students in. Liam Neeson, no, it's not. Yeah, it is Liam Neeson, is just sexy. I don't have another word. He's just compelling, you know. He's so good. And it covers a lot of ground. You've got Nazis, you've got concentration camps, you've got Auschwitz, you've got ghettos, you've got resistance and heroism. It's emotionally compelling, you know. And so I get it, and I've used it. But Spielberg just screwed up. And you know, part of that is probably Thomas Keneally, who wrote the original book, Schindler's Ark. The thing that annoys me the most, I mean, there's so many, it's a dramaturgical train wreck, that movie. Like, accuracy-wise, it's a mess. But the thing that really gets to me is that between the man who wrote the book and the man who directed the movie, they decided to leave the woman who actually did this stuff out of it. Emily Schindler is portrayed as this pathetic waif who travels back and forth and wishes that her debonair, brilliant hero of a husband would stop cheating on her. And that's just stupid. That's just not real. Emily Schindler was there with Oscar the whole time and had at least as much, if not more, to do with this than he did. And that just annoys me, that annoyed me pre-Me Too, and it annoyed me even more now that I've given a little more thought to feminism. And so, what I would suggest to any teacher who's, if I have planted a seed and you're like, oh, I didn't know that about Emily Schindler, she wrote a book called Where Light and Shadow Meet. It's required reading in my course on film and literature, in which we watch Schindler's List. And I would absolutely read that book. It'll take you half an hour. Well, it'll take more than half an hour. It'll take you half a day on the beach to read that book. And it's so worth it. If you're really a Schindler dork, David Crow wrote a massive tome on Schindler, and it holds up. It's really well done too. So I don't tell teachers what to do. If you use Schindler's List and you find it really effective, cool. But maybe if you haven't read Emily already, read that and work her into it. And there are a lot of ways to do it, like the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. That's not Oscar's tree. That's Oscar and Emily's tree. And interestingly, it's a beautiful 2-tree piece that goes up, And so I think there's a lot you can do there. I've written a lot about Schindler, and I'm happy to see more but. Thanks for the question.
All right, thank you. We are nearing the end, so if there are not any more questions, if there are, Mark has generously put his email in the chat. You can also, if you somehow missed it, you can email me and I can get it to him. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for participating, for your questions. Mark, thank you as always for a wonderful presentation. I got a lot out of it. I hope everyone else did as well. You guys have a 30-minute Zoom break, so feel free to go do something else before we listen to Wendy Lauer's presentation on women in the killing field. I'm so excited for that. I think Mark is probably going to pop in on that too.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so I will see you guys all in about 30 minutes. Thank you guys so much, and see you soon. Thank you, Mark.
Of course. Thank you.